Hello Year 11 Geographers, thank you for clicking on this video which is going to be your revision for your second part of your Year 11 mock papers this year, focusing on the challenge of resource management. So I hope to take no more than 30 minutes of your time just to go through the content that has been indicated to you as part of your mock in your revision checklist. So whilst you are watching this video, I would recommend that you have that checklist available to you, but that you also have something to be taking notes on, perhaps even in the form of creating a revision resource as you watch. So that could be a spider diagram, perhaps some flashcards, but just making sure that you are actively working alongside me, talking to you for this few minutes that we've got ahead of us, so that you have something at the end of it that you can refer back to. So I hope this isn't the only revision that you have done at the point at which you begin to watch this, but obviously you've got that support from your teachers and some recommended revision activities that you're doing in the background. So if we have a look at the first thing on your checklist, it's to have a good understanding of the global consumption of energy, and in particular here, the consumption of oil. So you'll have looked at this in the introduction section of resource management. It's worth remembering that resource management as a topic has this introduction section where you look at food, energy and water on a basic level, and then you choose, or rather we as a school have chosen to then delve into one of those, which we have chosen as energy. So this one actually thankfully does feature in both the introduction and your choice resource. So when you're looking at consumption, you're likely to be shown a map, and this one here is showing oil consumption in 2019. So as a geographer, you should hopefully be quite used to describing trends that you can see on a map. And if we look at the trend of oil consumption, you can see that actually the majority of countries using a lot of it, so the more blue colours, if you have a look on that scale of terawatt hours being used at the bottom, then it's mostly going to be in the northern hemisphere, with the exception of places such as Brazil. So describing that trend in an exam, you would need to make sure that you could also give examples of countries. So looking at the different ends of the scale here, you can see that China and North America are the darkest blue and therefore using the most oil. There's lots of Middle East countries, India, Russia, Canada, all within that northern hemisphere that are also using quite a large amount. If we contrast that to the lighter colours, so you have to be careful here to ignore the grey colour because we don't have data for those countries in terms of oil consumption, but you can see that there are some in the northwestern corner of South America, along with other countries such as the Scandinavian ones. We can see Sweden at the top of Europe, for example, is not using a lot. So making sure that you have got a good understanding of an ability to describe distribution of something across any map. So it's worth also making sure that you are able to think about what this means for the countries. So if you have got a country that has a readily available and plentiful supply of oil, that is obviously going to have quite an impact upon their development and also the lifestyles of the people in that country. So if we think about North America, who are the darkest colour here, they use the most oil according to this data, and therefore have probably got quite a good level of industry and their ability to do whatever they want with their electricity. They'll have enough to fuel their hospitals, to fuel their manufacturing, to fuel their IT and finance services. Everything will be very reliable as well in terms of their energy supply if they've got an access to this degree of oil. If you think about that, what that means for the individuals as well, obviously people are likely to have higher levels of income if they're able to work in a large range of industries that have lots of energy. Their education is perhaps going to be better also because they'll have access to lots of technology. They'll be able to get from one place to another if they're using these fossil fuels to get through in terms of transport and cars and things like that, there'll be lots of things that will be enabling them as an individual to have quite a good quality of life. If we then contrast that to some of the poorer regions with the lighter colours, then thinking about what that means for them. So if we have got a country that doesn't have a lot of oil, then they're going to really struggle to do all of those things that I've just said the USA is able to do with relative ease. So they're not going to have a reliable energy source. They're likely to suffer shortages. They're likely to have to pay quite a lot of money for the oil that they can get hold of, because it definitely won't be coming from their own country if they don't have a lot of it. And also that's going to have an impact upon the social factors of lifestyle as well. So if you don't have a readily available source of energy, then that could potentially impact your ability to transport yourself to a place of work, to fuel those hospitals, to ensure that they have got energy to supply life-saving machinery. All of those things are all going to be factored into a life without a plentiful supply of energy. Within your introduction section as well, we also looked at food and the availability of food. And obviously we're quite a small island, so we need to make sure that we have a good food security, i.e. that we have got enough to feed our own population and maintain a good level of nutrition. So we looked at two solutions when we're looking at making sure we've got enough food in our country. So the first one is agribusiness. So these are the huge farms that we don't have many of down here. They're mostly up in the northeast where the land is flatter. So if we're looking at areas like Linford House Farm in East Anglia, which might have been your case study in your lesson, and it's definitely the case study you've got in your revision guide, these are huge farms. You'll notice that the fields are massive, as is shown in the picture below. And that enables lots of machinery to get in there without having to go down country lanes and slow up the traffic and slow themselves down in turn also. So it's a very efficient way of farming, which means they can create huge quantities of food. They'll use chemicals to make sure that that food is potentially bigger in size, so you get more of it, but also that it will last a long time once it is picked and then on its way to our fridges or wherever it's going. So it does ensure that we have got a food supply that will last in the shops and be there for days after we've purchased it, as well as ensuring that we've got a plentiful supply, which also makes it cheaper. Now, the other option is to actually focus on quality rather than quantity if we want to make sure that our food is secure in the UK. So if we think about organic farming, we looked at the example in lesson of Riverford Organic Farms in Devon. Now, what's good about this is that this is quite a secure way of a household getting hold of their own food because it is transported directly to their door. It's organic, so in terms of nutrition, then it is fantastic for that. Because they're not using chemicals, it also ensures that the soil quality is maintained and actually improved over time. So we've not got it filling up with lots of chemicals, and that means that we've got a sustainable food supply as well. It's going to last a long time into the future without us having to worry about decontaminating our soil. Lots of employment in this sort of farming as well, because you can't get machines into the smaller areas of that farm, whether it might be individual fields or perhaps small vegetable plots. So you need lots of people to be working in this area. So it's good for local employment, as those people will be picking the food that the machinery would usually do. And of course, because it is being transported mostly to homes in the southwest, then we're ending up with fewer food miles and therefore impacting in a good way upon our country's CO2 emissions and reducing climate change. So having a good understanding of the differences, literally what are the differences between these two types of farming, and how they ensure that we've got food security in our country, by listing some of those advantages. The third point that you need to be happy with, ready for your mock, is the idea that the UK's energy and where we get our energy from is changing. So first of all, I thought I'd show you back in history, looking at the 1990s, what our energy supply looks like. So you can see very clearly that 67% of our energy in the UK came from the burning of coal. A lot of that was to do with the fact that we had lots of coal mines in the UK, particularly in places such as South Wales and even along the south coast in places like Cornwall. So there was lots of in-house production of energy because we had this supply of this fossil fuel. Now, if we have a little bit of a look at how that has changed over time, let's start with 2012. So just 8 years ago now, you can see that coal reduced quite significantly between 1990 until 2012. So this is now looking at 26% coal and more gas. So 37% gas, because we are now getting better at taking gas from particularly places like the North Sea. But there's other things that are starting to creep in. So renewables is the next biggest sector, if you have a look at that green one. And then we've also got nuclear and some others that, looking at kind of oil and interconnectors is perhaps a little bit more complex than we need to go at GCSE. But the main thing to note is the creeping in of renewables. If we then have a look at 2017, so according to this data collection, our most recent data, you can see that renewables has shot up to 37% of our energy is coming from those renewable sources. So that could be a range and will be a range. It will be solar, it will be wind, and perhaps some other kind of small scale renewables going on within our country. Gas has stayed the same, but look at coal, it's very much starting to disappear, isn't it? And then we look at our projections into the future, and we're looking at this, 44% renewable energy in our country by 2022. And the government has actually promised or expects that we should be closer to half of our energy should be coming from renewables by 2025. Whether the current pandemic is going to get in the way of that, who knows, because obviously focus is perhaps elsewhere at the moment. So gas, again, is still there. It's very much there. We're still taking gas, particularly from our oceans. But if you have a look at that coal, it has completely disappeared almost, hasn't it? We're at 3% of our energy now is coming from coal. Now, what you need to be aware of here is the impact of this. So there's going to be advantages and disadvantages to change all of the time, and you're more than used to, as Year 11 geographers, being aware of both sides of the story whenever there is change. So you need to think about the fact that we have lost, we don't use coal as much. So there's obvious positives there. Coal emits an incredible amount of CO2. So if we don't have that going on anymore, then obviously we have got a much smaller impact upon climate change, which is great for the environment. But you also need to think of the negatives. We have towns within our United Kingdom that were set up around coal mines, and the closure of those coal mines is going to have a negative impact on the employment in those areas, and actually leading to some quite significant levels of deprivation around those areas. Lots of unemployment, lots of poverty, where people are not able to find jobs that they can easily transfer themselves into after those coal mines shut. Looking at the other big change, more renewables, again, great because it is sustainable. This is potentially an industry that will create energy forever if we keep up and maintain our technology. But the negative is that obviously these things are going to cost a lot of money to set up, and a lot of people don't like things like wind farms and solar panels because they take up space. They're not always, in some people's view, nice to look at or aesthetically pleasing. So you will get quite a lot of conflict in communities as this sort of thing is starting to become the norm. When we think about sustainable energy supplies, which is towards the end of your checklist, we need to think about, again, what that sustainable word means. So sustainability, as a definition, is actions that meet the need of the present without reducing the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So if we think about something like solar panels, we are getting to the point where our solar panels and the technology around solar panel installation is really good now. So we could get to the point where things like this, these renewable energies, will allow us to get the energy that we need. And again, like I said, half renewable energy by 2025 would be brilliant. But what that's also ensuring is that we're not emitting lots of CO2 into the atmosphere. We're not using up a resource that's going to run out like coal. So we're ensuring that the generations that follow us are going to be able to do the same thing and meet their own needs with regards to their energy usage. But we need to make sure that this is not just about renewable energy, because actually part of making sure that energy is sustainable is to make sure that we are not using too much of it and we're conserving it wherever we can. So across both your studies that you've done in resource management, but also your studies particularly of things like urban challenges in year 10, we've looked at lots of ways in which we can make sure that energy is sustainable. So looking at things like BedZ, as you looked at in your case study of London, with those south-facing windows bringing in all the sunlight so they don't need radiators, thick walls to insulate, wind cowls to allow air to flow through the building so that you don't need to open the windows, because we lose lots of energy opening those windows to get some fresh air. There's also things like shared gardens in that area where people can be growing their own crops and therefore reducing their carbon footprint and the energy needed to transport food to their homes. But there's also lots of the transport things we looked at as well when we looked at London. So talking about those Boris bikes as they were initially coined as they began as a strategy to reduce the amount of congestion in London. You could also refer to the rent-a-car at BedZ so that people can just be in this car club that shares cars instead of owning their own. There seems to be a lot of change all of a sudden in terms of electric cars as well. So that bottom left-hand picture is, I forget the name of it because I'm not a car enthusiast, but it is a Volkswagen that is supposed to be coming out next year at the same price as a combustion engine. So this will be an electric car that is no more expensive than its combustion counterpart, so typical exhaust fueled and kind of like fossil fueled car. So that would be great for ensuring that this is sustainable in terms of the economy as well. We've got to make sure these things are affordable. And something else that's come in this year as well is something called the Green Homes Grant. So the government at the moment are trying to get people to invest in their homes and make them more energy efficient. So putting insulation in, whether that's into their walls or their roofs, and just trying to contain some of the energy that they are using perhaps in things like heating. So you can get a voucher from the government now. So if you spend anything up to £5,000 on making your home energy efficient, then the government will give you a refund voucher of 2/3 of the cost of those things that you've put into place. So there's big government drives as well to make sure that our use of energy is sustainable. So if I just go back to that first one to end on. So obviously this is only half of your mock, so please make sure if you haven't already that you look at my other video, which is looking at physical landscapes, rivers and coasts. I've also put some tips at the end of that in terms of making sure you are using key terms and explaining things. This is another part of your examination that doesn't actually go beyond a 6-mark question. So it's very much a case of making sure that you understand the key terms and processes associated with energy, and that you can explain things like sustainability and how we can effectively become more sustainable in our use of resources. So